Justin Schiller set up as a bookseller when he was still a teenager in the late 1950s, early 60s. His company is the oldest antiquarian book firm in the United States, continuously specializing in rare and collectible children's books in all languages and covering all periods. He works regularly to assist clients in many countries with collection development. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
What I'd like to talk about is your expertise in collection development, specifically with early children's books. But you yourself got a very early start in collecting when your parents dragged you along to antique markets. Is that correct?
My father was wounded at the Battle of Normandy in World War II. He was in the first landing, the infantry, and consequently, by the third day of his being at Normandy, he was wounded and went to the infirmary. Unfortunately, during the next week, the rest of his battalion were wiped out. So he suffered tremendous guilt over surviving for all this time. But in recovering from his wounds, when he returned back to the States, it was helpful for him and my mother to do restoration of antique china, antique porcelain pieces. And so they would go around to the various antique markets in Philadelphia and New York, looking to buy broken pieces, which they would then learn to restructure and recreate. And it was during this period that my mother promised me 5 cents for every antique shop they would go into where I would behave myself. And consequently, at the end of a day, we always seemed to have enough nickels to buy a Wizard of Oz book. And so that was my first collecting interest. At the age of 12, my Oz collection went partly on exhibit at Columbia University for the centenary of L. Frank Baum, and I became the youngest lender in Columbia's 200-year history. But even more unusual, at that same time, I had managed to find a not very good copy, but a first edition of The Wizard of Oz for $5 in Staten Island. And when CBS was broadcasting the original program of the movie, the MGM film, in late 1956, they tried to find a first edition, and all the bookshops told them to come to me. So my parents brought me down to the studio. Bert Law was there, and the idea was he was to introduce the movie by reading from the first edition.
He was the lion.
The Cowardly Lion, exactly. And Judy Garland was performing at a nightclub, it so happened. They sent a limousine to pick her up, but she didn't want to go, so she threw her daughter, Liza, into the back seat of the limousine. And the way the program began, without either of us being introduced, we were 2 children. I was sitting on one knee, I think Bert Law's right knee, and Liza was sitting on the left knee. And he was reading out of my first edition of The Wizard of Oz. And that's the opening of the very first showing of the film on television.
Did you stay in touch with Liza?
No. As far as I remember, she couldn't care less as to who I was and didn't really want to be there.
Okay, so you didn't fall in love with her then?
Enough other people did, so it's it was fine.
Okay. Now I'm interested in this porcelain that your parents collected. It just turns out that I have a great uncle who was a rabid collector of earthenware and porcelain, and he wrote some texts on it. His name was A.H. Church.
Remember what type of earthenware?
No, I do have a copy of the book, though. My eyes kind of glaze over. The only reason I picked it up was because he was related to me. I do have a book by him that sort of reminiscences, and it talks about about specifically what he collected. So I can certainly dig into that. But your parents were putting together porcelain that had been damaged. Is that correct?
In other words, they would buy a figurine, maybe a late 19th century porcelain figurine missing an arm or a head, and they would take an arm or a head from another figurine that was also missing other pieces. And so slowly they were bringing life to the damaged items. It was very good physical therapy for my father, and my mother had studied art, so she would be doing the painting. I think the business, while it wasn't greatly profitable, was sufficiently entertaining that she eventually helped out a antiques dealer in the Lower East Side of New York with a shop after my grandmother passed on. Then she herself went into antique jewelry and maintained a fairly distinguished career selling antique jewelry in New York City during the late 50s and the 60s.
So you had a model then of someone who was an entrepreneur.
Both of my parents were wonderful, honest, sincere people, but not especially well educated. My mother's father, whom I'm named after, Justin Gallen, he was a book collector. He died before my parents were married, and he was in the first graduating class of Cornell Law School, 1893. So when I went to school in Ithaca, I donated a small group of books in his memory. Just before he died, somebody had gone through the neighborhood and asked my grandmother if she needed any spring cleaning done. And she was a good woman but didn't understand book collecting. And so she very proudly sold all of my grandfather's books for $100. And it was believed that sufficiently weakened his constitution. And he had a heart attack from shoveling snow soon afterwards.
Okay.
And that finished him off.
It's funny, I can relate to that. My first wife sold one of my favorite LPs at a garage sale. I didn't have a heart attack, but boy, was I upset. Okay, so there is a bit of it in the blood then. Is that what you're saying?
And to say it was through my connection with Columbia University and the exhibition of the Oz material that I did meet professional rare booksellers and also professional rare book librarians. And they were mentoring me more than anything. I didn't realize I was being mentored, but one of the great people who helped me in the early days was Martin Gardner, a name many people might remember from his mathematical puzzles in Scientific American, as well as writing books like The Annotated Alice. He helped me formulate a program in collecting, and when a mutual friend of ours died, a man named Jack Snow, who wrote several of the Oz books, Martin was the caretaker of his estate, and we were able to not only buy a few things from that, but also I remember Jack Snow asking why the Oz people wouldn't just write to themselves and leave him alone. And so through the encouragement of Martin Gardner, at the age of 12 or 13, I created the International Wizard of Oz Club. And it was through that where Oz people did write to each other and very well established an organization that is still in existence today, founded in January 1957 and as I say, still going strong.
You sound like a bit of a child prodigy.
Well, it's I'm no Mozart. I can
What's
draw
that?
and I can play the piano. When I was at school, it was the period of the Cuban Missile Crisis and working its way to Woodstock and Stonewall. And drugs were all over the place, but I was getting stoned on books. I was very
Okay.
fortunate. I was able to help support my education by buying and selling books with my parents' help. And when I left the graduate program, I applied for membership in the Antiquarian Booksellers Association. And I was the youngest person at that time admitted. 1967, February, I would have been 26 years old. Of
Right.
course, we now have had younger members join, but I remember doing a lecture at New York Public Library that sounded a bit autobiographical. Memoirs of an Antiquarian Bookseller, I think it was called. Basically talking
Okay.
about the adventures of selling antique children's books. But everybody seemed to welcome the idea, and I was very fortunate to be doing it when few people really cared.
So the market was open for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
people like
Good.
Beatrix Potter was being very neglected as a collectible. And so I
Very good.
specialized basically in 18th, 19th century children's books. You could go to England with a budget of $1,000 and spend 3 weeks buying whatever you wanted, paying for your bed and breakfasts, and still have money left over.
It sounds like, well, it's the rich Americans coming over and pillaging England, is it?
Well, there were occasionally Americans much richer than I was. I can remember a woman named Ruth Baldwin. Well, her collection is in Gainesville, Florida,
Hmm.
and she would go into a bookstore and ask to look at their children's books and buy the entire wall. In those days, they were 50 pence or almost never a pound, certainly
Yeah.
maybe 5, 10 shillings.
Did she get her chauffeur to kind of carry it into the trunk?
No, no, she would organize having these books sent back to New York or back to America by way
Yeah.
of the bookshop. But all the bookstores told me that after she finished, she would look at them and say, "Point me to the station," and she would go marching off to the train station for her next stop.
Isn't that great? Just thinking about you establishing that Baum Wizard of Oz club, that was genius because you were put in touch, I assume, with a whole bunch of other collectors. Is that correct?
Yes, I was, and it was mutually beneficial because in those days I was buying Wizard of Oz books with color plates for anywhere from 50 cents to $1 each along the secondhand book row in New
Yeah.
York. And with a list of collectors, I could very often get $2 for the books. And
Yeah.
so I would double my money. And often when they would come to New York, I would give them a guided tour of the bookshops. And we developed long lasting friendships over many years. Arthur Houghton, of course, was one of the great names in rare book collecting, the Houghton Library at Harvard.
Yeah.
He donated upon his own graduation as a rare books library building. And Arthur had a great collection of books, which he gave to Christie's in London to sell for him. And I only mention this because I was over there and I did a little buying at the Houghton sale. The original manuscript to Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense came up for
Oh.
auction. And
Okay.
by accident, I was sitting next to John Fleming, who I knew from New York. H.P. Krauss was sitting across the room in another aisle. And when they
Wow.
introduced the Edward Lear, Krauss turned to me and smiled, and John Fleming gave me a push and said, "Go ahead, that's your book," because everybody knew I did children's books. Although I had no intention originally on bidding on, I bid, because what else could you do? Not only did I bid, but no one bid against me. So I got it.
What a gentlemanly thing to do.
Well, it was terribly kind of everyone involved. And then when I got back to America, I spent the next couple of weeks calling up all of our customers, trying to sell whatever I owned to pay for the Edward Lear.
Yeah.
But having said that, it wasn't so expensive. I think it was 10 or 15,000 pounds. And one day I received a phone call from Arthur Houghton, much to my surprise. And he had looked up my number, and he said, "The reason I'm calling you is because within 6 months, my bookseller and my art dealer, each of more than 50 years, have died." That's Jeffrey Agnew and John Fleming. And he said, "I'm calling you because I still have a collection of books that Christie's didn't take, and I felt you were the cleverest of all the bidders because you got the best buy of anyone." And so he invited me and my partner down to Maryland to visit him, and it was sensational. I had 3 or 4 visits with Arthur. He sold us an original manuscript to a Gollywog book from about 1900. The Gollywog manuscripts were originally sold by its author to buy an ambulance for World War I. And that's how they got into circulation. I remember Mr. Houghton telling me, he said, "Had you known me 20 or 30 years ago, I can assure you you wouldn't have liked me. But I've mellowed, and I've come to appreciate the meaning of the passion for book collecting." So we got along wonderfully. And when I wrote a book on the 1865 Alice, the very first printing, I dedicated the book to his memory. That was in 1990.
Okay, so how did you develop the reputation that enabled you to get in touch with him and have him call you?
Well, as I say, I was simply a buyer at his auction at Christie's, London.
That was it. And he just admired the fact that other people let you buy it.
Well, there's that, as well as other people overpaid. And he told me he enjoyed seeing people fighting for his good buys. And he said, of all the good buys at his sale, mine was the best. And in case you're wondering, that manuscript has ended up at the Coatson Children's Library at Princeton University. It was a donation I made in honor of Lloyd Coatson, who put together a great collection of books.
You know, you're making this sound all very, very gentlemanly and high-minded.
That's the way the rare book world was 20 or 30 years ago. I wouldn't recognize it today. It's very different.
Better or worse or different?
I think it's more commercial now. Back in the days of my developing a clientele and building a reputation, I would travel from one collector or one university library to another with an attaché case, showing them displays of books that we had for sale. And they would make a selection, and I would then go to the next. Nowadays, everything is so easily done on the internet. If I wanted to research a first edition of Hans Andersen, I'd have to literally go to Copenhagen and visit the Royal National Library.
That's tough.
Now I could just plug in. It has created a different approach that has made it much easier for people and at the same time more challenging because rare books are not as rare as you think they were. I have a number of books that in purchasing them, you have to rely on your own knowledge and experience. And I had never seen some books before. And so I offered a certain amount of money or agreed to pay a certain amount. And now that the internet came along, I just have to plug into one of the rare book search engines, and I could find half a dozen copies of the same book, often for half the price I paid that they're looking to sell for retail.
Okay, well, let's get back to obviously going around with an attaché case and meeting these people face to face. This really facilitated personal relationships.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have had some wonderful clients. I mentioned Lloyd Coatson earlier. Some people may not know his name, but if I say he was the CEO of Neutrogena, that would mean something.
Yeah.
And it was basically his father-in-law who created the company, Neutrogena, and kept it as a simple cosmetic firm that just dealt within California. And it was Lloyd who had gone to Harvard Business School after Princeton and developed it not only into a national but to an international company. And he used those resources to build what is the finest collection of rare children's books anywhere ever. And Princeton benefited from his philanthropy.
Right. Okay. So how did you meet him and how did you get him as a client?
Such good questions you ask. The great children's book dealer in New York was a man named Walter Schottky. He had come over to New York in the late 30s to escape the persecution of Jews in Germany. And Walter was able to survive and create a small livelihood by taking with him his personal collection, which he then sold to New York Public Library. Walter had a shop on 57th Street, which is one of the main thoroughfares of New York. Everybody who collected would enjoy going to him because he had not only books, but all sorts of gadgets, and his secretary would spend time cutting out decoupage and pasting them on mirrors. It wouldn't be expensive, maybe $10 or so, but people would just enjoy the novelty. As Walter was aging, in I think it was 1977, a year before he gave up his shop, Lloyd would always go in and visit him. He said, "There's a young fellow you should meet. He'll be around much longer than me, and he can help you build your collection."
Why did he point Lloyd to you specifically? Like, how did you get this bookseller to like you so much?
Well, I like to think I'm a likable person.
Okay.
But it partly was, I went to Walter when I was in graduate school. Okay. And buying and selling books. At that time, he was president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association.
Okay.
And he explained to me that as long as I was a student, I wouldn't qualify for membership because you had to be a full-time bookseller.
Right.
But he said as soon as you finish your bookselling, apply for membership and you'll get in. That was fabulous. I did, and I did, and I did.
Is it just a question of the two of you hitting it off? Him thinking, well, boy, this young man knows a lot about children's books? Like,
I studied. Very often, people like Walter might interrogate me to see how much I really knew.
Yes, exactly.
And, he also told me that you could tell a great bookseller by the way that their eyes would twinkle when they talked about books.
Okay.
And he pointed to me and said, "Your eyes twinkle."
So
and
where
I said, "So do yours."
Where did you learn about the children's books then? What did you do to learn?
Well, I was interested in children's books, partly from the Frank Baum beginnings, but also in just the history and development of books for children. How did they become a collectible? And what was there to collect?
Were there any specific books that really helped you along the way?
At the time, there were only two or three books published on the history of children's books. Harvey Darton was one. Percy Muir was another. These were books that I would read and reread and discover mistakes. Gradually, one develops a reputation. In 1973, the German publisher, I'm trying to think of the name now, well, it'll come back to me, the German publisher of mechanical children's books from Lothar Meckendorfer, the firm had been trying to relocate. And in relocating, they discovered they had all of the original file copies of the Meckendorfer mechanical pop-up books, as well as many of the lithographic stones for printing them. They contacted me to see if I would be interested in buying them. Of course, they're fabulously collectible, and so we were able to put together a consortium of investors. With that in mind, my partner and I flew to Germany, and we purchased all of the Meckendorfers that were available. Over the next couple of years, they did find another pile or two, but it was mainly the main batch that we got. And to that end, we had asked Marie Sendak to write an appreciation of Meckendorfer, since he was the major collector in the country. We published a catalog in 1975 with Sendak's introduction as the main text, and then a description of all of the Meckendorfer styles, each title, the many different reprints, publication history. That also helped to establish us and our credentials.
Was that a catalog?
It was a catalog with the hope of selling it as a collection, but I regret to say there was a lot of jealousy in those days, mainly from the German Booksellers Association, that an American, and I apologize for saying this, an American Jew would come along and take Meckendorfer, who was one of their national treasures, and take it out of Germany. This one particular dealer created a campaign to convince the universities that they shouldn't have interest in the original manuscripts, but rather only in the published version, because that's what was popularized. And so we had a hard time selling them. Eventually, I had to put them up at auction. You know, I was 10 years ahead of myself.
So you didn't sell them to Lloyd then?
No, although Lloyd was collecting, he wasn't that interested in mechanicals. He was more interested in the early history of children's books. And if you remember, I met Lloyd about 1977. Our Meckendorfer sale, I think, was 1982. It was a situation where ultimately I had to defend what we were selling, and so my company ended up buying back from the consortium many of the Meckendorfers we had initially purchased and cataloged. And ultimately, those were donated to UCLA in memory of a few great children's book librarians that they had. The big mistake I made, because they were manuscripts rather than books, I didn't realize, but when I donated them, they had to go to the manuscript curator rather than the rare books department. And because I didn't designate the fact that I wanted to be identified as the donor, when I have since subsequently seen my Meckendorfer manuscripts on exhibit, they don't mention my name. And I queried, why is that? And they said, because when you donated them, you didn't require us to do so.
Jeez, they can't do it retroactively then?
I tried, but the only retroactive thing that they do is, I finally stopped this, but for the next 15 years, I kept getting solicitations from the UCLA alumni department, which only irritated me even more.
Okay, well, let's get back to Lloyd. You hit it off. He saw the sparkle.
And Lloyd developed a great collection of children's books.
Yes, but he did that with you, no?
Primarily, although we didn't restrict him, he enjoyed going around visiting bookshops in every country that he would be in. I mean, I tried to keep aware of all the major things that he was buying. One of our other great collectors is a woman named Betsy Shirley. Mrs. Shirley was a very down-to-earth, wonderful lady. She and her brother were, the only two children of four brothers. The four brothers were the Beinecke family, and the Beinecke family were the ones who endowed Yale University.
Right.
When Betsy and her brother were children, her parents bought them a little island to play on. The island was Nantucket. Wonderful lady. She came to me when she was 50 years old. She said she was starting to have grandchildren, and she wanted to have the grandchildren learn what was the heritage that they were growing up in. And so she thought collecting American children's books is what she wanted to do. Now, her brother, who was a great collector as well, recommended Seven Gables Bookshop. That was Mike Papantonio and John Cohn, located in Midtown, New York. Seven Gables always maintained a wonderful inventory, but they were very protective over who they sold to. And Mrs. Shirley didn't want to ride on anyone's coattails, let alone her family's. So she would go in and introduce herself as Betsy Shirley. Had she said Betsy Beinecke Shirley, then they would have fallen over. But she didn't.
Wait a sec. They were snobbish and they didn't take anyone who didn't have a big name? Is that it?
I didn't know them that well, but there was a lot of competition to buy rare books.
Yeah.
And you wanted to be certain that whoever you sold to was substantial enough, that they weren't going to be, what do you say, a drop of water in a frying pan.
You wanted to make sure that you could provide them with a lot of good stuff and they could pay for it. Is that it?
Well, not only that, but that their collection would amount to something, would continue. I can remember one instance when Betsy was allowed to browse on the open shelves. She picked out a bunch of children's books, took them up to the front desk where a woman named Miss Schultz was in charge. Miss Schultz said, "I have to check with the boss," and she carried them in to Mr. Papantonio, who indignantly, I was told, rushed out to see who would begin to take books off his shelves without asking his permission. And when they saw it was an elderly woman, he said, "Oh no, these books aren't for sale, I'm sorry." And she was very frustrated. So at that point, Miss Schultz said, "You know, there's a new fellow in town who is doing children's books. Let me give you his name and phone number, and you could contact him."
It wasn't so bad after all then.
Absolutely not. This was 1971.
So we're at the beginning of your relationship with her. What do you guys do? Do you sit down and draw up a list, or what do you do?
Okay, at the time, Betsy bought a couple of books that reminded her of her husband, her family, like an edition of Davy Crockett for the Wild West, or one of the great editions of Pinocchio that she liked. But she said, altogether, if I have a fund of, say, $10,000, do you think we can find enough books to buy? And I said, I'll try. At that time, with all respects to Yale, the Beinecke name didn't mean anything to me. Nor she introduced herself as Beinecke. She was just Betsy Shirley.
But she had $10,000, though.
Well, she was talking about $10,000. I've had people talk about things much more than what they actually have.
Right. Okay.
But in any event, gradually the $10,000 expanded and expanded till towards the end we were spending easily $300,000 to $400,000 a year on
Right.
her collection.
Okay, but what did you do? Did you sit down and draw up a list or what?
No, it was a question of seeing what was available. I would make recommendations to her, and mostly she liked what I was recommending. Among the things we found for her, for example, there was an old, how to call it, periodical for out-of-print books called the A.B. Bookman's Weekly.
Yes.
And that would be published where you could not only list the books you wanted to buy, but also where you could list books for sale. I had this one early issue as it came out, which included a description of an original manuscript indictment for the Salem witchcraft trial. I bought it. I think at the time it was $400, probably in the middle to late 70s. What it turned out to be was not just any witchcraft trial. This was the trial for Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestors who have the House of Seven Gables.
Bingo.
I think Betsy probably gave us $2,000, a wonderful profit for me at the time, and it was a great coup for her.
What I'm trying to get at is, you're just showing her stuff, but she said to you, I want to, show my children our heritage. So how did you turn that into material? Like, what did you said, okay, well, I have to get what for her?
For example, the reason she bought the witchcraft trial was because the accusers were children. It was often based on what was available, what was coming up at auction, what we happened to have in inventory. There was no such thing as a set list. I knew things that she would want, but only if they became available.
Yeah, so it was you taking advantage of opportunities.
Exactly. And I was very fortunate.
Right.
This was also the point when the Edgar Oppenheimer collection was being dispersed by his family. Walter Schottky had been contacted by the family since he had put the Oppenheimer collection together. He was asked about finding a buyer, and Walter had called me in to discuss, did I know anyone who might be interested in buying this huge collection. And I was actually having a meeting with him at his office on the very time that the Oppenheimer family telephoned him to say that a French bookseller, Pierre Perez, had contacted them and had just purchased the entire collection. There was nothing we could do. It was over. What Perez did was he then divided up the collection. He sent the English material to London. The German material went to Germany. The American material got divided between Swan and Sotheby's. These were wonderful, rare children's books, and I used that opportunity to buy not only for Mrs. Shirley, but also for Lloyd Coatson and our other clients.
Okay.
It was at a time when children's books were not as popular or promoted as they are now. It was like, I don't know if you've heard, but one of my other specialties is Chinese propaganda. And people used to come over to me at a book fair because we would have a few portraits of Mao Zedong hanging up. And they would say, what other murderers do you represent? And I would try to explain that I'm not a communist. I'm not looking to promote Mao, but I'm interested in history and the fact that he was able to promote and manipulate 600 million people during the Cultural Revolution. That's what fascinated me. And it amuses me nowadays. You have wonderful dealers like Lorne Bear, who specialize only in propaganda.
Yes. I think some of these posters bore a resemblance to what Andy Warhol was doing, correct? Or vice versa.
Warhol was influenced in that Warhol went to China in 1970 or 71, and he brought back a giant portrait, a woven textile of Mao Zedong's face, and he used that as the model for his famous painting, and he redid that many times over. That was one of his keystone elements that was so successful in popularizing and promoting Mao. Warhol borrowed Mao's portrait.
That's what I thought, yeah.
And he made iconic images, both paintings and prints,
Yes.
that were among his most famous designs.
And that must have helped you.
It didn't hurt.
Yeah.
Although, had I been smart enough, I would have been buying Andy Warhol. It's unimaginable how those have increased in value.
Oh, it really is, yeah. Great museum in Pittsburgh, if you've ever been there.
I've been told about it. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a visit. But okay, so just winding down, I'm really interested in what defined the success of your relationship with, is it Betty or Betsy? I can't remember.
Betsy.
Betsy. So was it the fact that you just continued to provide her with exciting buying opportunities? Was that what kept you together? And
no, I mean, first we liked each other.
Yeah. So that would you like? Can you rank what it is exactly that defines the success of a?
We both recognize the twinkle, if you pardon my.
There we are again. Yes. Okay.
I mean, Betsy loved her material, and she studied it. A very interesting story. This happened some years after she had been developing a wonderful collection. Betsy died in 2004.
Okay.
But she began donating her children's books to Yale in the late, I would say, 1980s, middle to late 80s. It was difficult for the IRS to imagine this elderly couple giving boxes of old children's books and having them appraised for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They couldn't understand that. So they challenged her. They got a local appraiser who did household effects.
Oh, goodness.
To change his advertisement in the yellow pages. From us, in addition to household appliances, he now added rare books and manuscripts.
Nice.
If you could believe this.
This is the extent that they went to get at her?
Well, it was initially, they were trying to bring her to tax court and charge her with having overvalued her collection. However, we were always very correct and proper in doing the appraisals, and even having, because a lot of things came from us, we had a second fellow who did appraisals for Betsy, and I would be there mainly as an advisor.
Right.
So when it came to doing the actual appraisal work, one thing that they questioned, for example, I don't know if you know the expression 8VO octavo.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a traditional sign of abbreviation for the size of a book. The IRS specialist, in looking over Betsy's donation, said here they're claiming that there were 8 volumes in this book, and there was only actually 1 volume.
Right.
And in another instance, they got confused and they thought Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens were 2 different people.
So they were really bibliophiles then.
I researched the fellow's credentials, and unfortunately, in those days, you could be a member of this appraisal association by paying $35.
Okay, but what does this have to do with your relationship with her?
Yes, well, that's what I'm about to say. So Betsy and I created the idea of we had to challenge this fellow's reputation.
To justify the value.
Yeah, exactly. So we registered Betsy's dog as a member of the Appraisers Association. The dog was sent a membership card, framed up along with a picture of the dog. And we were going to enter this as evidence to show that this dog was as talented as their...
Probably knew more about books.
Well, he certainly sat on them. The bottom line was IRS caved in at that point.
Okay.
Because had we actually taken this to court, they would have had to pay all of her legal expenses.
Yes, okay.
So it was like this that gave us a very close relationship. And I talked with her virtually every day. She became almost a mother figure to me.
So, again, what are you saying? You're saying you went through various adventures together, you fought battles together. I mean, what is it that...
We researched, we built collections together.
You shared a belief, a vision?
Very much, and in a way, this worked against me because I devoted most of my time to Betsy and Lloyd's collections and keeping both of them satisfied and preferably out of conflict with one another. But in doing that, I didn't develop relationships with other university libraries or other private collectors. Peter Solomon, who is another name you mentioned, is a great collector, and his library is just being donated to the Houghton Library at Harvard. Peter also, basically, he started collecting by wanting to give his wife a 40th birthday gift of the best, most popular children's books in first edition. But as it turned out, he liked them better than his wife. So eventually he and his wife divorced. He got the books.
That's because what? She didn't like the books enough?
Well, no, she liked the house better.
I see.
Anyway, we've been very fortunate with wonderful clients, wonderful books.
Yeah.
And
what explains your success? I know we talked about the sparkle, but
I think
what else?
Because people had never taken children's books seriously. And what I would do is take not only children's books, but aspects of children's books and turn something that is not a children's book into a children's book. For example, you would have The Cries of London, books showing the various costumes of merchants from the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yes.
And I would turn this into a children's book by virtue of there having been children's versions of it. But I'm argue that it all begins with this, just like Aesop's Fables begins originally for adults and works its way down into books for children.
So what you're doing is what a lot of great collectors do, is that they're identifying materials that they think are important and undervalued, and then going after them as a team with someone who shares that interest with you. Is that it?
Pretty much, except there was still not so many people doing children's books. There was a wonderful fellow, more a character. He looked like Groucho Marx. His name was Milton Reisman, and his company was called Victoria Bookshop. Milt and I started business around the same time by way of opening my bookshop in New York City. I visited him once, and on the back shelf in his office, there was a whole group of Arthur Rackham books that were falling apart. And I said, Milt, why do you have these? Yeah. And he said, because every once in a while, he gets an Arthur Rackham book that has a missing picture, or even a picture that's torn, or a picture that's creased. And he doesn't like to have those type of descriptions. So he just takes those pictures out and he replaces them with any other picture he finds.
Yeah.
And I said, but trying to match up missing pictures should be almost impossible. And he said, no, it's not, because children's book collectors very seldom read the books they buy.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what picture you put in the book, as long as the book is advertised as having 40 colored plates, That's all they're interested in. Ever since then, I've been very cautious about handling Arthur Rackham books. Many of them could have come from Milt.
Well, how do you stick them in the book then?
Oh, they were generally tipped in. Yeah,
Got it.
you would have a mounted piece of cardboard
Yes, yes.
bound in, often with a caption on the cardboard, and then just above the caption would be a paper plate that would be tipped in. So if something is missing, you just tip in something else. That was at least Milt's philosophy.
And why do you mention him?
I mentioned him because at the time of our developing a market, there were very few full-time dealers.
Yes.
And he was one who took it all quite seriously. He's one of the names now that is long forgotten. He died of stomach cancer many, many years ago. His archives, in fact, we purchased from the estate, and they're now with the Coatson collection at Princeton.
Oh, lovely. Well, that's a nice thing for you to do for him.
Well, it's he, with the exception of his smoking terrible smelling cigars that permeated all of his books. With that exception, he really loved his books, and he loved the business. He had great fun, and he was a very good bookseller. He would also go to Europe and look to buy things at a time when, again, there wasn't much competition.
Well, isn't that just so much fun in areas that no one, that you know, or it's an important area, but no one else seems to realize it. That's so much fun to be right there.
Well, yeah, you can't always predict it, but it's good fortune when you can.
Yes. Just finally, I mean, are there as many different areas like this as there are subjects, or do you think that the whole terrain is being tilled to a point where this can't happen again, or what do you think?
I think the world is filled with opportunities to discover, and it's all a matter of discovering what. We had a client who asked me, how do you identify the first printing of Paul Bunyan? I had no idea, but I investigated it and I found out, and we put together a Paul Bunyan collection for him. It's a matter of finding things that you don't expect. For example, the first book mentioning Christmas, or the first book illustrating a Christmas tree. There are many ways of going about collecting. One of my most important, how should I say, aspects of being in business was the friendship with Marie Sendak. This cemented through our Makerdorfer collection. But having said that, I met Maurice in 1967, and in 1970, we had his first autograph party for In the Night Kitchen on publication day. And I remember we had 400 orders for the book. We advertised it in the New York Times, and he had to come back several times to do additional signings. One of those was, he said, what do I do with this? And it was a letter from somebody who neither of us knew, said, could you please ask Mr. Sendak to inscribe his book to Mary? Thanks for a wonderful night. Maurice. And Sendak said, do you know this person? I said, not at all. Do you know her? And he said, no. He said, what should I do? And I said, I would just sign your name. I wouldn't worry about it. But Maurice was a mensch. And so he wrote, to Mary, thanks for a wonderful night, Maurice. One day that'll turn up and mystify people.
Yes. He was in advertising before he got into illustrating kids' books, wasn't he?
Well, he was doing shop windows for FAO Schwartz. He ended up doing advertising for Bell Atlantic in the 1990s.
It seems to me that would be a really, I'm doing a little bit of that. You know, you learn about an illustrator or a book designer, and you find out that they did illustrations in magazines or for advertisements. And that's so exciting to collect.
Yes, this is very true. Sendak was incredibly versatile. Unlike many other children's book illustrators, he would adapt his style of art to whatever the subject was that he was illustrating. And as he said, it probably won't be until after he dies that he's finally recognized as an artist. And sure enough, his obituary in the New York Times described him as the most important children's book artist of the 20th century.
Very good. Well, when you think of it, his reach is incredible too, isn't it? Like the impact.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody knows Wild Things and Night Kitchen and Really Rosie and Little Bear, Nutcracker, one character after the other. Very influential. And, people say, oh, but he was such a curmudgeon. He wasn't a curmudgeon. He needed to protect himself because people would take advantage of you if you give them the opportunity. He had hired secretaries to work for him who he would discover were picking out trash from his garbage can and ironing out the paper and then selling them on eBay. But Maurice was a wonderful fellow, and he really will live on longer than anyone else I can imagine. I never appreciated what a genius he was until after he died and we began working on a memorial tribute, which in fact Leonard Marcus edited for us, and it was published by Abrams in 2013.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Leonard recently about Ursula Nordstrom,
who was Maurice's main editor.
Yes.
At Harper's. I met Ursula. She was a force to be reckoned with, I think the expression is. A very strong-minded woman. And at the same time, she directed the development and the focus on children's books through much of the 1940s and 50s. Another artist who we knew well, and he's now gone, but we represent his family, is a man named Leonard Riceguard. And Leonard Riceguard won a Caldecott Medal for The Little Island. I forget who his main publisher was. When he would do a manuscript, they would bring it into the publishing house, and the editor would show it to the black elevator operator. And if the elevator operator enjoyed it, they went to press.
The little focus group test.
I've never forgotten that story.
Okay, just finally, could you give some advice to someone who has an interest in children's books and now wants to take it to the next level and start collecting them?
Well, the most important thing is to follow your heart. Follow what really interests you. Don't be worried about price tags. I mean, you could collect paperback books. You could collect advertising novelties, anything you want. But you should focus on a collection, try to develop it, and build it into the best that you could manage. It doesn't take money. It takes energy. It takes ingenuity to develop and weave together a platform of what to collect, what to study, how to study, why is this interesting over something else, and justify what you're doing to the point where you're fascinated by it. And as long as you can still be fascinated, then you have that twinkle.
Yes, I was gonna bring up the twinkle. It's like if you see something, not a person, but a book or an object or a picture or whatever it is, manuscript, magazine, that makes your eyes twinkle, then that tells you something, doesn't it?
It makes me think that I don't have one foot in the grave yet. I still got what it takes to get my juices going.
Well, thank you so much for. I couldn't see your eyes, so I don't know if they're twinkling, but it sure sounds like they are. I really appreciate
they are. I can assure you, Nigel, they are twinkling, and I hope for a long time yet.
Me too. Well, now just before we leave, is there anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation to round it out?
Well, just the most important thing is don't be intimidated by fancy anything. I remember in college, they used to say that teacher puts their pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. If you have an interest in a book, don't let anyone else demean it or discourage you and saying, oh, that's not important. If you like it and you're interested in it, go for it and see if you can't make it interesting enough that that person will change their opinion.
Yeah, and I would say sitting down and writing about it.
Absolutely. The more you write, the more you think, the more you promote, and also read. There are many, many books now on the history of all sorts of book collecting. Find out which the best ones are, because you have some bad ones as well. But you should read the books.
What do you think's the best?
Well, I could only speak from the children's field. I like the book that we did as a memorial tribute to Sendak, called Marie Sendak, A Celebration of the Author and His Works, published by Abrams in 2013. There's a wonderful book by John Carter called The ABC of Book Collecting that
yes, very good.
Oaknell has just published an illustrated edition of. And we're hoping to have a live book fair in New York in September, second week of September at the Park Avenue Armory. If at all possible, come and visit. You don't have to buy anything, but just being around the material, seeing what is available, what prices are, that alone should stimulate your enthusiasm. And you never know when you might win a lottery and go after some of the big tickets.
That's great advice, Justin. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for including me, Nigel, in your series. All best wishes and congratulations.
Thank you. Hope to meet you in person at some point.
Come to the book fair.
Okay, it's a date. Thanks again.